Zero knowledge proof is a method or a technique for proving a statement is true without revealing why it's true. It's a mathematical construction, effectively, that lets you do that. And it's a cryptographic construction. The things that zero knowledge proofs give you, benefits, especially relating to Web3, are twofold: security and scalability. Aleo is an application of zero knowledge cryptography. It attempts to be a platform to build applications that are powered by zero knowledge cryptography. There's a combination, something of what Zcash brings, which is basically the security and privacy of transactions and everything, all the benefits of zero knowledge proofs, but limited to simple payments. Combining that with the power of Ethereum, which is the programmability of smart contracts. So Aleo uses a construct called ZEXE, Z-E-X-E, and that's the model that we apply on our own platform. So it's a new layer one. We're building our own chain. The execution model effectively is ZEXE. And on top of that, we have a smart contract language called Leo.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ben, and as usual, I'm the host of today's podcast. Today, we have Alex Pruden, the CEO of Aleo. Welcome to the podcast, Alex.
Hey, Ben, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, awesome. So before we get started, tell us a little bit about your background and how you got started into crypto.
For sure. So I came to the space in maybe a little bit of a roundabout way. The start of my career, I spent in the U.S. Army. I joined the Army because I was a kid when 9/11 happened. I joined the Army and I went to a military academy and commissioned in 2008, and then spent the next 9 years in the Army and did some time in the Middle East. And actually, my last deployment to the Middle East, I was in Turkey in 2015, working with Syrian rebels who were fighting the Assad regime and ISIS at the time. And, the mission I was on was focused on that, but kind of adjacent to that was, of course, the Syrian refugee crisis. And, got to witness that firsthand and hear stories of people who, in the course of having to flee the war, lost everything. Their wealth that was tied up in a house or just, in a bank account that they couldn't get to before they had to flee with their families and what possessions they could carry. And it was around that time that I learned about Bitcoin, and the idea that the thing that really captured me about it was, looking at these people who had fled from a country, were thankful to have their lives, but really they didn't have much else. And these are people who, came from largely professional classes, were well-to-do, but, suddenly were living hand to mouth in a refugee camp. And Bitcoin to me was fascinating because it was this notion of a bank account that you could carry in your head across any border anywhere. And it was effectively portable gold. And that got me really excited and interested in the technology. I left the Army in 2017, knew that I wanted to go into the space. It was just before the ICO boom was really kicking off. So I guess maybe it was good timing, but I got into, I attended Stanford University, where I was pursuing an MBA, but I was, kind of moonlighting over in the computer science department, trying to take cryptography classes. And also I started the Stanford Blockchain Club, ended up getting a job at GGV Capital as an analyst, where I covered the space. Some of your listeners may know GGV. They're kind of a fund that invests in both China and the US. Through them, I met the folks at Coinbase, had an internship there, was thinking about going back to Coinbase after I graduated Stanford, but was very fortunate to meet Katie Hahn on the A16Z team and the rest of the team. And they brought me on right before A16Z crypto officially reintegrated with the main A16Z fund. And I spent about 2 years at A16Z. But I mentioned before, I kind of spent some of my elective courses at Stanford studying cryptography. Because I was really fascinated by cryptography, especially within the kind of cryptocurrency, the many things you can study that are applicable. And zero knowledge proofs was something I learned about at that time from some of my Stanford CS courses. and was really fascinated by them and thought they had a ton of application. So, and I enjoyed being a venture capitalist, but I was really excited to potentially work at a startup, and that's how I found Aleo. I had known Howard for a while, and then I found out he'd started Aleo, and convinced him to let me jump ship from A16Z and join the team.
Yeah, awesome. So, you raised two things, right? You kind of already hinted what Aleo is, and you also raised the term zero knowledge proof, sometimes referred to as ZKproof. Could you elaborate a bit on what ZKproof is and how does Aleo come into play?
Yeah, so zero knowledge proof is a method or a technique for proving a statement is true without revealing why it's true. That's the simplest way to put it. It's a mathematical construction effectively that lets you do that. And it's a cryptographic construction. The things that zero knowledge proofs give you, in my opinion, the benefits, especially relating to Web3, are twofold: security and scalability. I use the term security. A lot of people say privacy, but I think of privacy of the data that you care most about is a form of security. So I'm using security here in that context. But by virtue of only having to prove that a statement is true without revealing why, you can prevent people from learning things that they could otherwise use against you at a future point. Like the most obvious example is front running, right? Where the information that you broadcast to the mempool on the Ethereum blockchain, for example, can be used by any miner or anyone who observes that transaction before it's finalized into a block. So this notion of protecting that information is what I consider security. And so that's one of the advantages of zero knowledge proofs. Most people are familiar with that, I think, because there's projects like Zcash out there that kind of really make that their focus. The other aspect of it, which people may be less familiar with, although I think are increasingly familiar with, is the scalability aspect. And this comes from the S in ZK snark, and the S stands for succinct, right? And it's a succinct proof. And the idea of a succinct proof is that it's the proof itself is much, much smaller than the statement potentially being proven. And the advantage of that is if the statement being proven potentially is the validity of a bunch of transactions or a bunch of state transitions, then you can very nicely compact basically all of that activity into a single small proof. And that's very good for blockchain scalability. And this takes a couple of forms. The more common form is rollups, right? So we see this technique applied in ZK rollups on Ethereum. The other way it's applied is in succinct blockchains or super light clients. Mina is the succinct blockchain, of course, and an example of a super light client is Celo, has the Plumo wallet. So anyway, that's zero knowledge cryptography and zero knowledge proofs. Aleo is an application of zero knowledge cryptography. It attempts to be a platform to build applications that are powered by zero knowledge cryptography. The simplest way to think about it is basically as a combination of something of what Zcash brings, which is basically the security and privacy of transactions and everything, all the benefits of zero knowledge proofs, but limited to simple payments. Combining that with the power of Ethereum, which is the programmability of smart contracts. So Aleo uses a construct called ZEXE, Z-E-X-E, which is short for zero knowledge execution, which is some research that came out a number of years ago, which I actually was interested in long before I learned about Aleo. And that's the model that we apply on our own platform. So it's a new layer one. We're building our own chain. So we have our own chain with our own consensus, and then the execution environment or the execution model effectively is ZEXE. And then on top of that, we have a smart contract language called Leo. And the reason we have our own language and we don't use some of the other, I think a lot of other layer ones use WASM or, and of course Ethereum uses Solidity. We had to purpose build our own language because, the target, when you're writing in programs in high level syntax, typically on a computer, they compile down to like machine code and get run. In this case, you need to compile them in kind of an intermediate step into this mathematical object, which is a proof. So you need to kind of have a special language and compiler just for that, which we have built, which is called Leo. And we have, if people are interested in what that looks like, we have a Leo playground. If you go to leolang.org, you can kind of see, you can get a sense for what it means to write a program, generate a proof about that program. And then lastly, we have on top of the language, we have basically all the developer and then user-facing products, which is a studio within which you write Leo programs. We're building a wallet. We have an explorer, things like that. So all in all, it's a full stack platform for private applications powered by zero knowledge in the Zexy model specifically.
Awesome. The really elaborate explanation on what ZKproof is and what Aleo does. Kind of covered some of my questions that I was about to ask, but I just want to dial it back a bit, So the main question will be, why do we need this, right? And I think a big part of that is kind of providing some context on privacy and the issues surrounding the security of our data. So, I think a important thing to highlight is kind of like how is online data stored nowadays, and how can ZKproof address this?
Yeah, well, I think the applications of this are numerous. Let me start with the last thing you posed. Today the model of the internet is the client server model, right? So basically what that means is I am the client. I want to access a page. I send a request to another computer on the internet, which is called a server. That server has the data about the page and potentially some state that relates to my account that it renders to me, or it sends back in a form of a message that then my browser renders, right? So effectively all of the data is being stored server side out of your control, outside of the client's control. This, by the way, like messages that are passed between the client and the server include things like authentication, right? And of course, a password is very sensitive data. There is a way that you're supposed to authenticate using passwords. It involves hashing. You're supposed to store, the servers are supposed to store it in a specific way that, prevents people from doing all these very common attacks. But the reality is, as a client, you actually have no control over whether or not the server is doing those things correctly or not, which is why an obvious application to me of zero knowledge cryptography in just the Web 2 context is authentication, right? Where you can effectively prove the statement that you are you. That's kind of general, but you can apply that a number of different ways. But prove the statement that you are you as the client, and then the server doesn't need to store any data about you. And that means you as the client don't have to trust that the server is doing all the right things and storing the data properly. And as we've seen many, many, many times in the short history of Web 2, servers often don't do the right things for a variety of reasons. So that's I think the obvious one. And that just, I think, demonstrates how this technology can apply beyond Web 3. Within Web 3, the applications are numerous. I think the first place I'll start is, a lot of people look at this and say, privacy. And again, I prefer the term security, but let's just use privacy because it's more common nomenclature. They're like, well, why do we need privacy in these transactions? And my thesis, and this may be controversial, is people feel that way because I think it says something about the state of Web 3. It basically means that we are in the extremely early days because no one is doing anything serious enough to require privacy. It's I think serious, and let me define what I mean by that. Serious economic activity is not occurring on chain outside of speculation type stuff, right? Like new project, you're doing some yield farming, you're trading it on Uniswap, whatever. Like that's the vast majority of it. For use cases like, well, really any economic use case, like buying supplies from a vendor, running a business. People are used to a paradigm in the real world where my bank knows what I'm doing, potentially my government knows what I'm doing, but no one else has to know, right? Like that, the traditional financial system is actually very private, except for a couple of parties that I myself choose to trust, typically. Yep. It's not always the case in the government's case, but typically for a bank, it's true. In the Web3 model, you give your information up by default to everyone all the time. And that it's hard to describe how much more extreme than the current system that is, right? I think like just the example of a USDC payment between you and me, if I send you USDC, not only do you know what I'm holding in my account now, you know every person I've ever interacted with and every transaction I've ever had before that. Like it's actually crazy if you think about what it implies. So I think to me, as soon as if we all believe that this is the future of finance, the future financial infrastructure for the world, then I think we need a way to be able to let people choose what degree of privacy they want to have for what application. And zero knowledge proofs, I think, are a nice way to let you do that. And, you can selectively reveal things outside of the proof. You can use a view key to give people one-time access to a transaction. But it's basically a way to tune the amount of privacy that you need. And also, I think it's essential for certain applications. For example, identity. The model that I just described on Ethereum, where everyone knows everything, just doesn't work for a use case like self-sovereign identity. The whole point of self-sovereign identity is I want to be able to prove to you that I graduated from Stanford without you knowing everything about me and without you having access to all of my other credentials. That's a key tenet of it. It's just impossible to do that in the traditional account model or in the Bitcoin, kind of open UTXO model. You need some form of data security effectively. So I'll pause there since there's probably more to unpack, but I'll let you drive it.
Yeah, so I completely understand that, and like you said, there's a lot of instances where privacy or security, as you like to call it, is essential for protecting ourselves. But then again, with ZKproof, there's always that counter argument that most authorities will probably raise is, but then again, those bad actors, they can hide the transaction, they can hide the financial activity. It's the whole point of, this facilitates essentially money laundering. And what would you say to that? How do we balance this against the principles of accountability and transparency? Or do we even need to in the first place?
Yeah, no, I think, look, my answer to that is that zero knowledge cryptography is a technology like many other technologies that are used by bad people to do bad things.
Right.
The solution, just take the internet, for example. The internet, there's all kinds of nefarious activity happening on the internet right now. Does it mean we ban the internet? I don't believe so. And I think that's the question is, how do you regulate the internet? And that's a question that is up to governments and societies, right? And similarly, I think that is how Web3 is going to evolve. Different governments and different societies are going to decide, that this is a great technology that enables a lot of things, but ultimately, I think the way it's regulated is going to depend jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But I think the key thing is it gives you, there's no way on the scale of total liberty to total control. You really only could go so far down the path of empowering the individual before you had a technology like this, right? And now it lets you tune that dial all the way to that point if you want, right? It's a very empowering technology for individuals to do digital liberty, right? And I think that's certainly liberty in general is a principle that is very important, and certainly the American system, many Western systems, but I think across the world people all appreciate its value. But again, ultimately, how these systems will evolve is going to depend on how governments regulate them. But let me just give you an example of a system that I think perfectly fits in an existing regulatory regime. You can construct a stable coin using, for example, Aleo. And, again, Aleo supports what are effectively smart contracts, and you can, prove that I'm paying somebody who's not on a terrorist blacklist, right? And you can prove that to a government. A government can be convinced that that's true without having to see who you paid, right? They just, as long as, of course, this presumes some identity system, but let's just hand wave that for a minute. If the government knows that I'm not breaking the law, they don't have to see what I'm doing, right? Because the only reason the government's audit transactions today at banks is they want to make sure no one's breaking the law. But if you just prove you're not breaking the law, then not only is that more private for you, it's less invasive, but also it's actually way cheaper for governments and banks to comply because they just don't have to have a compliance department, right? You can mathematically prove that you did everything correctly, and then that's it, right? Now, of course, that presumes that all the laws are all encompassing and presumes a system of identity. But nonetheless, I think that's a breakthrough. That's not possible in today's world. Everything has to be manually audited. So I think there's definitely an upside to this technology from a regulatory compliance standpoint as well that needs to be mentioned.
It's really interesting that you raised that because I never thought about it, and it makes complete sense, right? It helps with that as well. It's not just a lot of people like to look at the negatives, but it's actually a great positive from what you raised.
Absolutely. You think about just pull some public financial statements from big banks and just look at the amount of money they spend on compliance departments. It's massive. It's a massive amount of the economy is spent basically just hand checking things, right? I mean, even just in crypto, like, you go through all these KYC processes on exchanges, and ultimately it boils down to somebody just looking at a driver's license somewhere or a passport, right? And it's like that's all it is, right? There's no secret magic behind it, and again, that aspect, you can, again, you have to kind of assume there's some infrastructure like digital identity, but if you assume that, right, something like zero knowledge proofs just enables you to have a system like that that's much more efficient. So something that I think a lot of people forget.
Yeah. All right. So let's change it up a bit. Let's talk about Aleo. So like you said before, Aleo is building an L1. And, from what I read the white paper, not all like the information that's up online. And essentially, Aleo is using a proof of succinct work consensus mechanism, which is actually a variant of the proof of work system, right? Like what Bitcoin normally uses. So you kind of mentioned it earlier, Lee. So I'm just asking, why this mechanism? Why not something more conventional like a proof of stake? Is it because of technology?
Yeah. So actually, it's funny you bring that up. We're actually considering right now whether or not to continue to go with POSW or change it up to a more simple mechanism. That's actually something that we're considering. And, when we have our testnet 3 coming up in the next couple of months, it may be something that we experiment with. I think POSW is going to be our default, but there's obvious advantages. And I know this podcast isn't about consensus algorithms. We could have an entire podcast just about that. Exactly. So I'm gonna table that. But let me just go back to why we started Aleo with Proof-of-Succinct-Work and the principle that we're really trying to achieve. That even if we tweak the consensus at launch, is something we still want to make sure is there, and that is the incentive that drives miners to develop specialized hardware. As we've seen in Bitcoin, that incentive has been incredibly powerful over the past 10 years. I mean, you go back, I guess now it's more like 14 years, but like, when Bitcoin launched, Satoshi was mining it on his laptop. He was the only one mining it for a year or whatever. And basically, the first year and a half or two was the CPU mining era. And then you got GPUs, and then that was a couple of years, and then people started messing around with FPGAs. But then honestly, within 6 or 7 years, you had people that were purpose building hardware to perform SHA-256 effectively and the Bitcoin mining algorithm. And now you have that to the point where some of the most advanced techniques are used to build these chips, right? And they're at the size and scale that are at par with some of the most advanced hardware in the world. And that's incredible if you think about that. It's almost as if you took Moore's law and smashed it down into a single decade. That's really kind of what it is. And zero knowledge cryptography, I mean, I've been talking about during this podcast, I think has amazing promise for all kinds of applications, both in what I call the web of information, Web 2, and the web of value, Web 3. But let's talk about the costs for a minute. You can imagine computing a complicated mathematical object is expensive, and you're right, it is. Like it's if you, as opposed to performing a computation, quote unquote, in the clear, it's massively more expensive. And having specialized hardware that is purpose built for that application can massively speed that up and make a huge difference in real world time. I mean, asymptotically, which is a computer science term people may or may not be familiar with, kind of in real world time, it becomes like the goal would be to take the cost of that computation in zero knowledge and take it down to roughly at parity with a regular computation. And an example of how this has already happened in our lifetimes is encryption on the internet. I mean, we're all beneficiaries of the fact that basically everything today is HTTPS by default. Everything runs TLS. I remember, like I said, I went to high school in the early 2000s. I remember there was a time when everything on the internet wasn't encrypted by default. And that was because it actually, it took time to encrypt it. Like you felt the loading, like it was like noticeably longer on your computer, in your browser. And that didn't change really until Intel introduced a set of instructions that were specific to AES and some of these core encryption algorithms that power TLS. And so again, that's just a simple example of how introducing some of these things into hardware can basically turn something from being a cost to not even being noticeable. And that was the goal of POSW, is to let's turn this computation of a zero knowledge proof. I guess I should say what POSW is very quickly because people might be confused at this point. POSW is basically just POW but take the problem of SHA-256 hashing and turn it into zero knowledge proof generation. And for a variety of reasons, which I can go into, that is directly applicable to proving applications on the Aleo main chain. But anyway, the point being is that like if you can get that proof generation process very fast and very efficient, that has all kinds of ancillary benefits and basically enables all these use cases that I've been talking about.
I really appreciate you explaining because it's interesting, right? There's just all sorts of things that go behind the scenes. And thank you so much for the technical explanations. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. No, it's there's a lot of, I mean, I love crypto. There's so much nuance and even in a project like Aleo, I mean, Aleo is of course just one project. Yeah. But yeah, no, there's a lot there. It's what keeps it exciting.
So this brings me to my next question because we talked a lot about ZKproof, but as we all know, well, as a few of us might know, it's not the only kind of privacy or / encryption method, especially for blockchain. Just few months ago, we already had a Secret Network, another privacy blockchain that relies on a different method to enable privacy-related transactions. So my question is, could you describe the different standards of privacy within the blockchain, and where does ZKproof stand? Is it really high, really secure and private? Yeah, what is it?
Yeah, I mean, I'll fast forward to the punchline, in my opinion, which shouldn't be surprising to people listening to this podcast, given where I sit. But I think zero knowledge cryptography is kind of the holy grail of privacy for a couple of reasons. One, like I said before, it's tunable. So you can choose what you want to prove inside of the statement, what you want to prove in the clear. So it's very easy to tune the amount of privacy to the given application. Two, it's entirely quote unquote software, which means that, proof systems can be updated or iterated upon, or you can use a different set of setup parameters. And it's more flexible after, since it lives in software and it's not baked into hardware. Maybe this is a good time to describe some of the other approaches that are out there for privacy. One very common one, which is used, for example, in Secret Network, is using the hardware security module. So there's this device inside most CPUs today, which is a hardware security module, which is an isolated execution environment from even the rest of the device. And so it's a way in which you can do more or less private computations that never really leaves this tiny isolated hardware module. The advantage of this is it's very efficient. It's, as we talked about, the importance of hardware earlier, and this is literally on the chip. So it's a very efficient. It's a very efficient way to do private computations. The disadvantage is you have to basically trust that the hardware security module will never be compromised for all time, right? And I think this is potentially a bad. My belief is that this is potentially a bad assumption for blockchains, especially because the state of, by definition of blockchain, you need to be able to trace the history of transactions from the beginning of the ledger all the way to the current time. And so that really means like at any point in the future, if you figured out how to compromise this hardware security module and any single device, it doesn't have to be just your device, like you potentially, lose a lot of privacy there. And there's already very well documented attacks on these hardware security modules. People are interested, they can Google Spectre, Meltdown. These are two well-known attacks that already show they're quite vulnerable. So that's the disadvantage. And again, of course, I guess the other disadvantage is you can't really ship an update over the air to your CPU, right? You got to buy a new computer effectively to address that. So that's the disadvantage of that potential approach. There's other approaches out there that like Monero uses, something called ring signatures. I think it's a really interesting approach and very cool. It's less flexible. I think it's a little bit harder to tune the degree of privacy that you want there. And it doesn't enable quite as rich of a category as applications as zero knowledge proofs. In the future, we have things to look forward to, like fully homomorphic encryption, which basically that fully homomorphic encryption is a fancy way of saying you can run computations over encrypted data, which means you don't have to reveal anything about the data, but you can run any computation you want over that data. it's zero knowledge proofs. The way I think about it is kind of like a weaker form of that. You can basically prove one function over some data that only you know, a witness, and it's just a yes or no answer. That's like kind of what you have to get. So it's kind of a very weak form of that. But fully homomorphic encryption is of course the holy grail, because then everybody can just encrypt all their data all the time, and any answer you could possibly want, you could just run this FHE algorithm. The problem is massively today it's just completely it's very expensive, even compared to zero knowledge cryptography. It's so expensive as to be impractical. So then that leaves us with zero knowledge proofs. And I mean, we could have a whole discussion about the various flavors of zero knowledge proofs, which exist. There's Starks, there's ZK Starks, and then within ZK Starks, there's, well, actually a Stark is a ZK Snark, but whatever. Anyway, there's bottom line is there's a lot of these things. And we could talk about those if you're curious, but that's kind of my take on the different privacy solutions.
Yeah. I mean, it's great that you gave an overview, because like I said, we had Secret before, and we didn't really dive into the technicals of privacy and security, but I'm glad that you raised this, and kind of showcased that there are different standards, and, everyone has the trade-offs.
Yeah, exactly. That's fundamentally, I think, the key thing is, like, in all these systems, there are trade-offs that you have to make. And, you kind of, for the given application, you have to choose which one. Look, and honestly, for certain classes of applications, hardware security modules may be perfectly sufficient. My personal belief is for something like a foundational financial application, you're going to want more than that. You're going to want it to be cryptographically secure, not secure just in the silicon. But I think there are plenty of applications where a hardware security module is fine.
We cover quite a lot of things, and you even mentioned Stark, and one of the common solutions that a lot of people that is getting quite a lot of traction right now is actually StarkNet, basically an L2 solution on Ethereum. I'm just curious about what Aleo's thoughts are on, why not use an L2 solution? Why did you build your own blockchain instead?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, I don't always like the framing of L2 versus L1. I think in some ways in Ethereum, it mostly holds, but I think certainly when you get outside of Ethereum, there are many cases where, Polygon, for example, I think connects to a couple of different networks, and Polygon is much larger than any of the others besides Ethereum, right? So you could argue that, most of the settlement is happening maybe on Polygon and maybe by extension Ethereum. So what's the L1? What's the L2? Anyway, but I get the thrust of your question. So Ethereum. So I guess this is a point which I should say, Aleo is not an ETH killer. Aleo is not a Bitcoin killer. Aleo is not a killer of any other project in the space. I mean, one of the things I love about blockchains is the open source ethos around these communities, right? And everyone is encouraged to and excited to experiment and with different technologies and go different directions. I think even in a world where Aleo is wildly successful, there will still be a place for Bitcoin and Ethereum and other chains too. I mean, I firmly believe that the future is going to be a multi-chain world. That said, we looked at actually building a more Ethereum-centric solution at the beginning. In short, the reason we decided against it is the restrictions on the cryptographic primitives that you would have to choose if you were building on Ethereum. For example, the curve that Ethereum uses for its signatures is this curve called BLS 12381. And for a variety of reasons that are not worth getting into, it's just not very efficient to do a Zexy type execution model. So you'd have to contort yourself in all these various ways to figure out how to make that work. And if you really want to see how complicated it is, dig into the docs of some of these layer 2 solutions with regard to how the ZK EVM is going to work, right? Because it's very, very hard in most cases to have a zero knowledge powered solution that's efficient built on Ethereum, because when they were building Ethereum, like, they didn't consider it for this use case. And so that's why we're building Aleo, is we're building from the bottom up, knowing that the consensus layer has to basically interoperate with all of the cryptography on top and do so cheaply. So that was the reason why we decided to take our own approach.
I guess, we covered quite a lot of things about Aleo, and I kind of want to wrap up this session with two things. Firstly, what are Aleo's plans for 2022?
That's easy. Launching the network. We've had.
When?
Yeah, by the end of the year. The plan is to launch by the end of the year, and we're feeling very confident about that date. So we've had 2 test nets so far. We've had 3 security audits. We've run a setup ceremony, which is generated the public parameters. We had a couple thousand people contribute to that. So it's the biggest, I guess now it's the point where I should highlight that we have run the biggest setup ceremony of all time. And so we have the public parameters needed to instantiate all of these snarks, which make up the system. And we're preparing over the summer to launch a 3rd and final test net, which will just run right into mainnet, which will hopefully be at the end of the year.
Looking forward to that, because
me too.
And last but not least, I generally like to ask, was there anything that I should have asked but didn't, or anything that you would like to share with our audience here at CoinGecko?
Yeah, sure. One thing immediately comes to mind. So an initiative that I'm personally working on that Aleo is part of, but not explicitly leading, is something called the Z Prize. And the Z Prize was actually born out of one of our experiences that we had, or our experience that we had during our own testnet. So we had testnet 2, miners were doing Proof-of-Succinct-Work. And what we noticed was, a lot of the knowledge required to produce zero knowledge proofs cheaply, efficiently, was just very concentrated into a few groups that knew how to do it well, which is great because they were very invested stakeholders. But also from a blockchain perspective, it's not that great because you're supposed to be decentralized, right? So, and you kind of want this knowledge to be out there. So we sort of thought about how could we decentralize effectively the knowledge that you would need to do these computations very efficiently. And we came up with this idea of a competition to basically have people compete to submit the best algorithms that could produce these proofs. And the winner's solution would be open source, and then everyone could benefit from it. We realized after starting to kind of design that competition that this had potentially applications all across the space. And one of the things in particular that I noticed was that there is so much. We talked about Bitcoin and how quickly that evolved. I think zero knowledge cryptography has also moved at light speed, and it's amazing all of the bright minds that are working in the space. One of the drawbacks, though, is that innovations happen inside ecosystems and often aren't shared outside of them. Right? Everyone is kind of working in a silo of their own projects. And what we realized is if you gave people an opportunity to try and combine some of these innovations, you could potentially move the whole industry forward, and this technique of zero knowledge cryptography move it towards being practical. And so that's sort of what our kind of Aleo competition became, is we invited the whole industry to say, hey, propose a problem that you think is interesting, that is applicable to you or to the industry. And, let's form a competition around it. Let's invite competitors to go submit solutions to this problem. And the winners' solutions will be open source. So people can find out more about this at zprize.io. But the problems that, for example, the Z Prize is targeting is a lot of the lower level primitives that are required to be computed while doing zero knowledge computations. For example, multiscalar multiplications, fast Fourier transforms. These might not mean anything to anybody on this podcast, but the short answer is it's basically all about accelerating this low level math or these specific problems like hashing that are going to very much be important in driving this technology forward going in the future. And so there's 32 companies in the space that are participating, including the Ethereum Foundation, Polkadot, us, Mina, Anoma, Manta. I could go through the whole list. There's tons, but yeah, you can see on zprize.io all the list. Also, AMD is providing hardware, and we have several other technology partners as well. So if people are interested to learn more about that, anyone can apply to compete in these prizes. The total amount of sponsorship money for the prizes is around $7 million. And then there's tokens on top of that. So if you're a PhD student somewhere who thinks you might want to earn some extra money over the summer, there's a good opportunity to probably do that. So you can check out zprize.io and there's more information there.
Yeah, great that you shared that. I'm sure there'll be at least 1-2 listeners that might be interested. And I think that's about it. Thank you so much for coming on, Alex.
Yeah, Ben, this was great. Really appreciate the invitation. And it was a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invite.
For the latest crypto prices, visit our website. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to keep up to date on the latest crypto trends.